was published by Washington State University Press in 2020. And the view that we have here is actually from the Nisqually Prairie. So this is the part around the mountain that we're going to be focusing on tonight. So let's get started. Let's get on the bus. Everybody climb on, get comfy, get a good seat. And I'm going to bend your ear a little bit as we drive up to the park. But here's one of the views of the Nisqually River watershed. We are inside Mount Rainier National Park here, so this is just giving you a little preview of what we're going to be getting ourselves into. And we are looking up the Nisqually River watershed toward the mountain. And I tell you, one picture, 1,000 words. There is so much to talk about just in this picture. Tonight, we're going to learn about this. I like to call it a virtual field trip in the Nisqually watershed. And let me show you what I mean a little bit about how many things are in this picture to talk about. First of all, if you have ever been up to the Paradise side of Mount Rainier National Park, you have probably driven across the Nisqually Bridge here in the center of the photograph. You've probably gotten to Paradise that way. It crosses the Nisqually River. This photograph is actually taken from Ricksecker Point, one of the turnouts on the way up to Paradise. It's a really neat spot to check out if you haven't taken the detour into Ricksecker Point. Eugene Ricksecker was an engineer who actually laid out the road. He was in charge of building the road up to Paradise in the early 20th century under the supervision of Hiram Chittenden. And Ricksecker was an engineer, and he laid this road out just to perfection. It was really a work of art and really before its time. Next time you ride the road up to Paradise from the Nisqually entrance, you just notice how beautifully it's laid out, and you get these nice little, what they call a peekaboo view of the mountain where you pop around the trees, bam, the mountain is out, just knocking your eyes out. And it's just a really beautiful road and very well done. And that was over 100 years ago when that was done. And so this particular area is named after him. It's called Ricksecker Point. And believe it or not, it's a lava flow. All of this here, believe it or not, this is all a lava flow that came down the mountain thousands of years ago. And the glacier at that time was this high, hundreds of feet high, across the Nisqually Valley. In fact, geologists have figured out that right in here, this is an area of contact where the hot lava came in contact with the snow and ice of the glacier, if you can believe that. So hundreds of feet thick. The next time you drive across the Nisqually Bridge, I'd encourage you to think about that. And speaking of glaciers, the last thing I think about this photo that's cool to think about is that this little grove of trees here is just about the furthest extent of the Nisqually Glacier in the 1800s. So in about the 1850s or so, this was how far the glacier extended down the river valley. And you can see now, here's the bridge, and now you'll see that the glacier is actually retreated a couple of miles, 2.5 miles up valley, since it was at this point back in the 19th century. Pretty interesting stuff to think about. So tonight's trip, we're going to actually start up high on the mountain. You could think of this as being a trip from the Alpine Heights. We're going to take it all the way down to the Salish Sea, where the river runs into Puget Sound at Billy Frank Jr. National Wildlife Refuge. And I imagine there's a bunch of people here tonight with me that the mountain is probably one of our favorite things in the world, geographic spots. And I would imagine, as a member of Kitsap Audubon, I would imagine that the Nisqually Refuge is also one of your favorite spots too. And it certainly is for my wife Valerie and I and our kids. We've been going there. Kids have been going there their whole lives, and they're in their 30s now. So you can think of it from Alpine Heights to Salish Sea. You can also think of tonight's trip as taking this from mountain goats down to the gooey ducks. So let's get started. We're going to just get you comfortable on the bus. We're going to just keep rolling on up to Paradise as we get started on our virtual field trip. And one of the first things I want you to see is where we're going to begin. right here. So when we get to Paradise, we're going to take a short walk out to actually see the glacier and where the river actually began. So it's kind of like, if you want to think of it, the delivery room of the Nisqually River. We're going to get a decent look at that. And then we're going to roll in the bus down the hill in 78 river miles. We're going to follow through Ashford, through Elby, these other small towns, all the way out to where the river empties into Puget Sound. Lots of great stories along the way, really interesting things to think about, some great restoration projects that are going on here, just tons and tons of good people doing really good, important work in this watershed that has really made it a really important and really a landmark watershed. I'll say more about that as we continue. So probably one of the first things we ought to do, I think, as we're still motoring up to Paradise is pay some respect to the original people, the original inhabitants, the Nisqually Apsh. I was fortunate to have been able to study the native languages of this area. I studied Pulshutzid for many years at Muckleshoot. Those folks would have been able to speak with the folks living in the Nisqually watershed. Nisqually people also spoke a dialect of Lushootseed language. And so far as we know, there were no year-round villages, Nisqually villages, within today's boundaries of Mount Rainier National Park. But there are a number of really important villages along the way, and I just want to point a few of those out for you. There was apparently a year-round village just outside of today's park boundaries. It would have been not too far from Longmire. And if you're familiar with Skate Creek, the Skate Creek Road, you might be able to see how the name of that village was anglicized and turned into Skate Creek eventually. There was also a village near present-day Elby. There was a large and important village below the present LeGrand and Alder Dams. Just a little further downriver, the village of Michelle was important for its inhabitants. The Satulik, who was known locally and legendarily as Indian Henry, hailed from this village. So too did one of the guides who guided Lieutenant Couts on his summit attempt in the 1850s. And most famously, Michelle was the home village of Leshai, who was a noted orator and a Nisqually leader. And Michelle is pronounced and spelled a variety of different ways, but the spelling you see here is one of the more commonly accepted spellings of that village. It's where the Michelle River empties into the Nisqually, not too far from Eatonville. This particular village is really important on Muck Creek because it was the birthplace of Willie Frank. Willie was the father of Billy Frank Jr. and lived to be, 100 years, 99, 100 years old before he passed. And Willie was a fascinating person and was really basically a cultural bridge between the 19th and the 20th centuries because he grew up in this village as a young boy. He had stories to tell, and he was very comfortable talking to historians, ethnographers, other people who wanted to know about the lifeways of the Nisqually and the Puyallup people. So much of what we know is actually because of Willie's willingness to talk to people and to share his cultural knowledge with them. And then down at the mouth of the river, as it empties into the sound, two villages, one on the right, Nisqually, which I believe means a place of hay, and the Nisqually Apsh, the Nisqually people. Nisqually Apsh means people of the grass, people of the river. So Nisqually means place of grass, I believe. And then Swadadab is a word that means something along the lines of medicine or spirit. It might have been a place where people went to, get spirit. And if you know the original name of McAllister Creek down there, it was historically called Medicine Creek. So that's probably where the name Medicine Creek came from, was from the village Swadadab. So those are some of the important villages in the watershed, traditionally of the Nisqually people. And as I said, no known year-round village within the park boundaries. But there's a really interesting uh, temporary summertime camp area in the Nisqually Watershed. And if you have ever hiked up to Indian Henry's hunting ground, you've been very close to this open area. If you have ever hiked the Couch Creek Trail, you can park at the Couch Creek picnic area and hike up Couch Creek. You've been within a couple hundred yards of this particular site. So this is where ancestors of Nisqually people came for thousands and thousands of years in summer after the snows had melted back and set up camp. Mixed groups, men and women, their children, extended families, aunties and uncles, grandparents, I'm sure, would come, set up camp here for days or weeks in the summer. And what we know now is that their principal purpose in coming up to the mountain in the summertime was to access resources. And I've got a bit more to say about that in just a moment. So if you have seen one of my prior talks, you probably have met Greg Burchard. He was is now the retired archaeologist at Mount Rainier National Park. And much of what we know about Native people going up to the mountain is because of Greg's good hard work, his good hard thinking, his field work, his reconnaissance in the field, his writing. He designed models that helped explain where and when people went to the mountain and when they changed their habits and their patterns. Is really indispensable in what we know in developing the park's archaeological history. So hats off to Greg for his good work. He's actually in a unit here working. This is the place I said that's in the Nisqually Watershed. And in this shot, the person in the background here is the present park archaeologist. This is Ben Diaz, who continues to work also as the tribal liaison. And what that means is that Ben reaches out to the tribes that surround the mountain, works with them, involves them in projects, lets them know what's going on, and invites them to collaborate with them. So like I said, what we're pretty sure the main reason people went to the mountains was to access resources. We come to find out that in places like these units that were being excavated that you just saw a moment ago, folks may find bones and teeth belonging to mountain goats. And if you are a mountain person, if you've been into the Olympics, well, certainly you have seen and you know the story of mountain goats there, which are not native to the Olympics, and hence part of the reason that they have been and are being removed. I don't know if they're completely removed now. But at Mount Rainier, mountain goats are native, believe it or not, inland and native. And so if you go to the right place at the right time in summer, you've got a really good chance of seeing mountain goats. The Burroughs Mountain area is a good place to go look. So is Panhandle Gap. And a summer or two ago, this was as close as we got to this particular group of goats. You can see some younger ones in here. And you also notice they apparently had gotten the memo about the pandemic. You notice how they're socially distancing? You see that? Isn't that great? That's about as close as we got to them that day. But I did get a photograph of some goat prints. Those are the handles of my trekking poles for a little scale for you. And heck, I don't think any talk is worthy unless it's got some scat in it. So here's also some mountain goat scat nearby that I was able to click a pic of that particular day. Another resource that folks sought, of course, were Quarry Marmots. They were on the menu for some native groups, but you can imagine the thick wool or the thick hides, the warm hides of these animals, like mountain goats. These were also, like mountain goats, made into blankets and robes, and would have been really warm for folks in the winter, and also probably would have lasted for generations. I don't know if you know much about marmots, but these are some wild animals. What I mean is, for example, if animals were furniture, I think marmots would probably be a lazy boy recliner. These are not the most ambitious four-leggeds in the history of the world. In fact, they spend about 8 months of their year underground. They spend most of it asleep. Between about October and May, they're completely conked out, about 8 months of hibernation. And you've seen them in summer you know what they're doing in July, August, and September, right? They're scurrying around the meadow, and mostly they're eating flowers. So they seem to have a pretty low-key life, and their numbers are really good. They're in very good shape these days at Mount Rainier and elsewhere, the hoary marmot. So besides these animals, people also went to the mountains for plants, for a variety of reasons, medical reasons, spiritual reasons, technological, and for food. These huckleberries are probably one of the biggest draws for native people to the mountain. Still, a clean half-a-gallon Ziploc bag of huckleberries draws big money on Indian reservations. I can tell you that. They're really regarded as very valuable. And what people did back in the day was they taught themselves how to preserve them. So they would dry them over a fire, and a low smoldering fire, and then dry them out. And then they could rehydrate the berries over the winter months. And of course, beautiful, valuable source of vitamin C. So what a good deal. So we're just about up to Paradise. So let's get ready to get ourselves off the bus, stretch yourself a little bit, get out, hit the restrooms real quick if you need to. And what we're going to do is take a short walk from Paradise out to the Nisqually Vista Trail. And as we're out here now, we're looking up, beautiful day in summer up at the mountain, and right into the Nisqually Valley. We're going to take a closer look at the glacier here momentarily. You might be able to make out the river. Looks like a little trickle coming down the middle of the valley. But just for a moment, the next time you're up here, try to imagine that valley from rim to rim filled with ice and snow thousands of years ago. Just a really amazing thing to try to think about. So as we get a close-up, here's where we're going to look. This is basically, all of this is still glacier, believe it or not, right here, as in this picture, in this close-up. So this is all glacier, and most folks are really accustomed to thinking of glaciers as being this beautiful white, blue-white, icy snow, and when in fact, most of the glaciers at Mount Rainier are covered by debris, and this is what they look like. Well, here's the delivery room. Here's the Nisqually issuing forth from the glacier. And those of you who've seen some of my previous talks, you might remember the status of the glaciers at Mount Rainier and the status worldwide of glaciers. We're in a lot of retreat worldwide and regionally with the glaciers. And for those of you that haven't seen it, I just want to share a couple of side-by-side photos with you. Here is a shot that was taken over 100 years ago of the glacier. I've inserted that yellow star so that you have a reference point. Compare that with this photo taken 100 years later from the exact same location. And it's pretty easy to see the loss of ice and snow from side to side also coming straight down at you. The change is pretty dramatic, and this is echoed on all of Mount Rainier's glaciers. All of them are at their minimums right now. And we'll be getting some new information in the next few months. There was just some photographic work, photogrammetry work done by airplanes this past fall. And so we'll know more when the results are published, what the extent of the glaciers really is. But what we know for sure is that they're at their minimums. They never have retreated so far up the mountainsides since record keeping began over 100 years ago. So let's skip from here. From the terminus of the glacier, about a mile south and east over to the big draw, over here in the Paradise flower fields. One study showed that about half of the people that go to Mount Rainier go to see the flowers. It's usually a short show, just a few weeks long. In late July or August, it sometimes extends into September, relates a lot to the snowpack and the snow cover and how quickly things melt out. But this is one of the most fantastic flower fields anywhere on earth. If you look at a list of like the top 50 alpine flower meadows, Paradise at Mount Rainier is usually ranked in the top 10. It's really that fantastic. And if you have enjoyed it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And if you haven't, put it on your list to do next summer. Get up there early in the day and preferably on a weekday if you can, because it's just crazy people. And that's been part of the story at Paradise ever since European Americans have started going up there in the 1800s. As you can imagine, incredible views, fabulous wildflowers, If you're early in the day, you'll see wildlife. I mean, there's so much to draw people, and people have been drawn in hordes ever since, even before the road was completed. And did you know, for example, that there was a ski operation, a downhill ski operation with a rope tow that operated at Paradise for over 40 years. So people have come in flocks to do all sorts of things to this area. Did you know there was a 9-hole golf course? Ill-fated, it only lasted for 2 years, but there was actually a 9-hole golf course at Paradise at one point. So all of these things and all of these people have really brought impacts, have really brought some ecological damage to the meadows because, well, for a lot of years, we really didn't have any idea what the heck we were doing. We didn't understand the short seasons up in this area. We didn't understand the fragile nature of these ecosystems. And so damage has happened. And in fact, one of the most damaging activities were the pony rides out of Paradise that lasted for many decades. And even after the last pony left Paradise, the effects, these huge ruts, these ditches, several feet deep and 10 feet wide from, the ponies had dug out, just persisted. So a lot of ecological damage, anthropogenic as they call it, human caused at Paradise over the ages. And if there's a good side to that coin, it's that damage just kind of slingshotted or created this incredible series of restoration projects that has really enabled this area to bounce back and be a model, along with restoration projects at Olympic and at North Cascades National Parks, that in the high country everywhere in the West, people now look to these 3 parks to see what have people done here to restore the native plants. It's really a cool story, and I want to tell you a little bit about that. One of the greatest things actually began at North Cascades National Park. A couple named Joe and Margaret Miller back in the 70s were shocked with how terrible, how horrible, how run down and just torn up parts of the North Cascades were. And they took it upon themselves to rehabilitate the Cascade Pass area. And they convinced the Park Service to start a greenhouse program at North Cascades. And it was so successful, collecting native seeds in the summer, in late summer, and then raising plants over the winter months, and then planting them into the ground the next fall, was so successful that it caught on at Olympic and it caught on at Mount Rainier. And what these people are doing right here, these volunteers, they have a chance to do it every year, even through COVID as best they can. These, of course, were photos taken pre-COVID. But people come and put in thousands of hours to put in thousands of native plants in the ground. All of these plants have been grown from seed that has been collected in this particular area so that the genetic signature, if you will, is kept intact. So there aren't any plants that are like from a crazy place or non-native plants that are put in the ground. And so people have worked for years now, volunteers and park staff, to rehabilitate part of the meadows that have been run down by the ponies and by the other types of human activity over the years. Another really cool outgrowth of all this was that park staff realized that they were having a hard time keeping people on the trail. People just, they didn't respond to like plastic rope or signs or barriers, but what they did respond to was a uniform. People in uniform. These folks are volunteers. You might be familiar with the Meadow Rovers, and this was a complete invention at Mount Rainier. Many of these folks are retired school teachers or people who've been, in the public, have worked with people, know how to work with groups, and they get oriented every year. And then they spend the summer working shifts in the high country, walking the trails, interacting with visitors, helping people understand the fragile nature of the meadows, helping people understand how to be stewards, how to stay on the trail and off the meadows, those sorts of things. So the Meadow Rovers have become a really important part of the restoration of the meadows at Mount Rainier. These folks were our Meadow Rovers over on the Sunrise side, but if you go to Paradise any day in summer, you're sure to run into some uniformed volunteers that are giving of their time to do the best they can to help rehab the upper meadows at Mount Rainier. Pretty neat stuff. So back on the bus, everybody. I don't want to leave anybody behind. We're going to roll down the hill and make a couple of stops. So we're going to leave Paradise, and we're going to make a stop. Oh, if we were doing this 100 years ago, we would stop where the Nisqually Bridge is today. We would stop and everybody could get an ice cream. If you can believe it, there is a Royal ice cream stand right where the bridge is today over 100 years ago. So people could stop and buy an ice cream. A crazy idea. And the other thing that's neat about this photograph is here's the glacier. This is all Nisqually Glacier here. Can you see that? And I don't know what the distance is, but you know, like I do, that these days you can't see the glacier from the road at all. So I don't know if it was a few hundred feet or a few hundred yards, but 100 years ago, you would have had a much closer view of the glacier from the ice cream stand. So now let's roll down a little further. We're going to make a stop at a place called Van Trump Creek. This is just above Cougar Rock Campground. And here's the road that Eugene Ricksecker engineered, put in the early 1900s. Did I mention that Mount Rainier was the first park to allow automobiles? In about 1908 it was, and that was a super big deal. People like John Muir, naturalists like John Muir and John Burroughs said, no cars. Those things are like locusts. They're going to destroy everything. They're horrible. Don't do it. But that was the way that Mount Rainier was designed to be a car park. People from Seattle and Tacoma were going to be able to drive in their automobiles to come to the park. And so this road, when Ricksecker laid it out, and you see the car here, when Ricksecker laid the road out, it was about 30 feet, the road was 30 feet above the creek bed of Van Trump Creek. 30 feet. And these days, if you can find this spot, and you can, there's a nice wide asphalt pullout that you can pull out and cross the road and come over. The Van Trump Creek empties into the Nisqually River. So obviously it's in the Nisqually watershed. And so things move down the mountain from these glacially sourced rivers. They move sediment, sand, and debris and other rocks and material. It's a normal process. It's called aggradation. And again, I talked about this briefly in one of my previous talks, so this might be a review for some of you. Aggradation is normal ecological process. And at most years, through most of the 20th century, the aggradation sediment accumulated in Mount Rainier's rivers from one study, showing that it accumulated at about 4 inches per decade. So you know what glaciers do. They grind the rock, the bedrock beneath them. So they grind that up, and those particles get suspended in melted ice in water, and that's what gets carried downriver and eventually, in this case, down into Puget Sound. Well, imagine how surprised park geologist was when he discovered that in one 10-year period, there was an increase by a factor of 9. He was finding evidence of sediment accumulating 36 inches on average in some of Mount Rainier's lowland rivers. 36 inches, that's a lot, from 4 inches to 36. And you might say, well, that is a lot. What's going on? And again, if you just think of the upper mountain, that snow and ice is like the glue that holds stuff together. As that snow and ice has melted and deteriorated and broken up, more and more rock material has been available for downslope movement, and that's exactly what's happened here at Van Trump Creek. A series of debris flows have dumped millions of cubic yards of material down Van Trump Creek, and so now there's actually areas where the creek bed is as high or higher than the road, and you can see that for yourself if you can find this spot. It's a really interesting thing to think about. So when that happens, you're going to have less room for high water events, right? So when you're going to have more and more material coming into these lowland creek beds and riverbeds, when you have a high water event, like the floods in 2006, you're going to have damage. You're going to have water going where you don't want it to go. And in this case, right through the Longmire maintenance area, almost washed the emergency operations command building down the Nisqually River. And you can see some of the damage here. Huge deal, closed the park for 6 months, right? $20 million worth of damage, infrastructure was damaged, roads and trails were destroyed, just a super big deal. And all of this related to climate change as a result of that snow and ice up in the upper mountain, giving way, deteriorating, allowing more rock material to fill in these lowland river areas. So flooding is going to become of a higher frequency. The other thing that happens is that this rock material can spontaneously release. And if we move just a little further down the road to the West Side Road, we're almost out of the park now, and we've got lots of more cool things to see in the watershed. I think this is our last stop inside Mount Rainier National Park. This is up the West Side Road, and 40 or 50 years ago, Tahoma Creek was a nice, mild-mannered, narrow little creek. You see this ghost forest, they call it? Those trees did not grow up in the riverbed. Those trees grew up at the creek side. Tahoma Creek came just right through here probably in the 1960s. So since we've had more and more melting on the upper mountain, we've had an influx of debris flows, over 30 coming down the mountain carrying, snow and ice and water. Rock material has brought millions of cubic yards. Whoops, I hopped ahead of myself. Millions of cubic yards of material down Tahoma Creek. And where does it go? The rivers and the creeks widen themselves. You see how it's gotten wider. It's expanded its margins. Water seeking its own level, trying to find a place to flow through. And what happened here was the park got really concerned that they were going to lose access to the West Side Road. Even though you and I can't drive up it, it's important for the park to have it as a resource for safety and search and rescue operations so that they can drive up the West Side Road. They like to get up the West Side Road for maintenance operations sometimes. So they wanted to keep it open. But as Tahoma Creek continued to expand and widen, there was actually a risk that it was going to completely erode and wash out the West Side Road. So the park did something that was really groundbreaking, and okay, that's a pun. What they did was they started a new program on the recommendation of a couple of the park geologists, start a program they called Imminent Threats. This excavator is on the West Side Road, and it's digging out here. The creek would be to your left, and it's digging out to insert these log bundles that actually do great work when the flow is restored to the creek. They will slow down that flow and allow the creek to drop some of its sediment. And if you can imagine that changing the grade of the creek bed so that the water will actually start to flow away, in this case, away from the West Side Road. These things work like magic, just like Lucky Charms. They're really awesome. I'm going to show you their cousin to these log bundles here in just a moment as we go further down the watershed. The other really neat thing they did was this bioengineering project, as it's called. This crew is putting in a willow wattle, W-A-T-T-L-E, a wattle. And it's basically a living wall of alder and Sitka willow. They put these sticks in the ground that will take root, have taken root, and they're helping to hold the earth in place between the road here and the creek that you see behind the folks. And you can see some of the log bundles that are in place here. See that? So back on the bus, folks, I want you to stay awake because we've still got a couple of cool things to see, even as we leave the park, even before we get to our next spot. So we've been hanging out here all this time in the park. Our next stop is going to be in Eatonville. Okay, we got a couple of sites to see in Eatonville. But as we drive to Eatonville, let's make sure that we notice the Mount Rainier Gateway. This is a 2,500 acre tract of land that's been set aside, preserved in perpetuity. This is really important area. The Gateway has, as I said, 2,500 acres of really varied habitat. It has the headwaters of the Michelle River in it. Busy Wild Creek flows from here and into the Michelle River. So this is an important piece that is held in reserve. Also, let's note the Nisqually Community Forest, the largest community-owned forest in the state of Washington, also held in reserve and also used to generate jobs and also recreational opportunities for folks. Both of these projects are the work of the Land Trust. And this is a small group of highly energetic, highly committed and focused people, the Land Trust. And they have stewards of over 9,000 acres. What that means is they have helped acquire easements and outright purchases of land along the Nisqually River to protect 3/4 of the Nisqually shoreline. Their goal is to get to 90% someday. So right now, 3/4 of the Nisqually River is protected from any kind of development. No housing developments, no resorts, no storage barns, protected from development, 3/4 of it. And the Land Trust works closely with the River Council. And actually, the River Council has been so successful in bringing together so many partners, odd bedfellows, if you will, from private interest to federal interest, tribal interest, state and federal, so many different people, stakeholders that serve on the council that have helped it become one of the most important river councils and the oldest river council west of the Mississippi River. They've done such good work with the Land Trust and their other stakeholders that the Nisqually River Council has actually won awards, conservation awards, for the work that they've done. And some of the projects are what you and I have next on our docket to check out a few of these things. Here's two of them in Eatonville. Enumclaw, right, Jeff? Wrong watershed. In Eatonville. This is at Smallwood Park, and this is a relative of the log bundles. These fisheries biologists are checking out this structure, this engineered log jam. And these posts that you see here, these are big bruckas. Okay, you don't have much for scale, but you would be hard pressed to put your arms all the way around one of these. That's how big around they are. And they're stuck down into the ground below the water surface, probably 15 to 25 feet. So an excavator has stuck these things in perpendicular down into the ground, dug a hole and stuck them down in there, and then wedged all this other material. Can you see all this other root wads and roots and limbs and logs and all this other stuff? Does the same thing as the log bundles. In high water events, it slows down. This is on the Michelle River, I believe. It slows down the Michelle River, allows its sediment to drop, slows it down, and then changes the grade of the riverbed. And also, in this case, gives a great place for salmonids, migrating salmon, to hang out, peace out, escape from predators, and to feed. So engineered log jams are really great application of the best available science and engineering techniques to really make a difference in this and other watersheds. Neat stuff. Similar project, not far from here, a place called Ohop Creek. You might have heard of it because this has been a big deal project for many years. The Nisqually Indian tribe was front and center on this project. They had lots of partners, including, I think, Ducks Unlimited, the South Puget Sound Salmon Enhancement Group. Ton of groups and good people came together. This area, the Ohop Creek area, was farmed by Swedish dairy farmers. It was immigrants who came here in the late 1800s. They were dairy farmers. That's what they saw when they saw this area. And so what they did was they took the windy, meandering Ohop Creek and they straightened it. They straightened it because they wanted it to drain quickly so that it would be good pasture land for their cows, for their dairy cows. And it was a success for them, and they dairy farmed there for many years. It was, however, a disaster ecologically and a disaster for the 4 or 5 species of salmon that at one time migrated and spent time on Ohop Creek. So what the tribe did, the Nisqually tribe, and with its partners, they raised a ton of money. And in the early 2000s, they basically reworked Ohop Creek to kind of reinstall the historic meanders so that the creek is no longer straight and fast flowing. The creek meanders through this Ohop Valley now, and they have installed log jams, as you see here in the foreground, to slow the water down. These plastic sleeves now house some very well-grown cottonwoods, red alder, probably some dogwood, I forget what else in here, all native plants, thousands and thousands of them that have now grown up, throwing shade onto the creek to keep temperatures lower, enhancing the conditions for salmonids, and the fish are back. The fish are back in a really big way and a really great win for everybody in this area. So those are a couple of projects of the River Council and their many partners. So we're going to hop back on the bus. And where we've been hanging out now, we've been in Eatonville, okay? We're going to take a drive. And again, just eat your snacks and get into your thermos, knock back some of your coffee and your tea. We're going to roll through all the way down to Joint Base Lewis McChord. So our trip is going to be mostly over, but we've got a couple of really important stops. And the next one is at Joint Base Lewis McChord. So when we get here and we get off the bus, it's a beautiful day. And one of the first things you might see is just Mount Rainier looming in the distance. And what you are standing in is some of the most valuable remaining habitat of a oak prairie ecosystem in North America. That's what this is, prairie oak ecosystem. One time, this kind of ecosystem spanned all the way from Canada to Oregon, basically along-ish the I-5 corridor. All right, what we have left today because of development is only about 3%, just a handful of square miles remaining of the original prairies remain. And as you can imagine, that's put a huge dent in the biodiversity, the plants and animals on the prairies. For example, last time I checked, there were nearly 50 species of plants that were on various watch lists, threatened and endangered lists, statewide and nationally. So plants have taken a big hit. And also the bird species. Here we are at Kitsap Audubon tonight, and records show that about half of the bird species of the prairies have experienced either population loss, a reduction in their range, or they've been extirpated altogether. They've been made locally extinct. So the key is we have to preserve what's left. There might not be much to knit back together. There may never be 10% of the original prairies put back together, but people are really focused on preserving as high a quality as possible what there is that remains. And so how would you do that? And if a lot of this is at Joint Base Lewis McChord, how would you preserve the prairies? Well, if you don't know, the answer might seem kind of crazy and a little counterintuitive. Believe it or not, the best way is to allow the training exercises to continue. And that's because many native prairie plants respond well to low-intensity fires. And there's plenty of records that show that Native American people maintained the prairies with fires that they set deliberately over the ages to keep out the plants that they didn't want. And things like salal and camas and the berry bushes respond very well to low-intensity fires. So the fires that these shell explosions cause is actually better, most people think, is actually better than a strip mall or a housing development. So I want to share with you two species-specific projects. I think I've talked briefly about each of these in a prior talk, so I'll keep them short. And then I want to talk to you about kind of an ecosystem-wide project that's going on here. JBLM, as it's called, or some people like to call it Jablam. At JBLM, really ground zero for some great restoration projects. Department of Defense working closely with the Nature Conservancy and other organizations to really do their best to preserve what's left and to give the plants and animals there a fighting chance. One that's listed as threatened on the Endangered Species Act, the Taylor's checker spot butterfly, once abundant. Some of the record counts, people saw thousands of Taylor checker spots in a single day in the spring back in the day. Now they're found at fewer than a dozen locations on the Nisqually Prairies. But in a really unique project between Department of Corrections, Washington State Department of Corrections, and the Evergreen State College, they've created something together they call the Sustainability in Prisons Project. These incarcerated people and others have raised over 18,000 larvae and adult Taylor checker spot butterflies on site at their facility, which are then later released out onto the prairies. And so there is a shot at redemption for the Taylor checker spots. And the people that I've interviewed have told me that the butterflies do as much for them as they're doing for the butterflies. It's a really win-win beautiful type of situation. The other was one of our birds for the special birds talk of Mount Rainier that I gave last year. This is the streaked horned lark, a couple dozen subspecies of horned larks. You and I have only seen a horned lark if we've been on the prairies. This is the horned lark of the prairies. And biologists became concerned about the numbers, and this bird is listed as threatened under the ESA. And what they noticed was that there were low hatch rates. A lot of eggs were not even hatching. And those that did, a lot of the few birds were being recruited into the adult population. That's called a low fledge rate. So they got really concerned, and what they figured out was that there was also a higher possibility of disease. And they figured that they had an inbreeding problem. What they needed was some genetic diversity. So they hatched a plan, again, sorry for the pun, they hatched a plan they called the Genetic Rescue Project. And those of you that saw the Special Birds talk a few months back, you might remember that the Genetic Rescue Project is just a fancy euphemism for an elaborate kidnapping plot, because what they've done, biologists will drive down to Corvallis and they will steal a clutch of streaked horned lark's eggs that are genetically different, but still streaked horned larks, very robust population down at Corvallis, and those birds will relay up to several times in a season. So you can steal their nest and their eggs one time, and they will still nest again. Bring them back up to Joint Base Lewis McChord and hope that birds here will adopt and basically take on eggs and raise the young from those eggs that they did not biologically produce. And believe it or not, this sort of thing is working. Here's Germaine. That's not like a pineapple upside down cake that she's bringing to our meeting or a group or to a potluck. What she's got there is an incubator that has been plugged into the cigarette lighter in the vehicle. And she has just completed the several-hour drive back from Corvallis. And here's what's inside. Actually, streaked horned lark, clutch size, 3 to 5 eggs. If everything goes perfectly well, they get it back. They will put the nest in an area of the prairie where there is a pair of horned larks that have not yet built a successful nest, hoping that they can, trick them or induce the birds to take on this nest. And if it works, well, then you get a big ball of fluff and you get some hope for the future. This was another nest, super productive female. Check out how many young she's got here, just counting the beaks. Half a dozen. So really a good project that's making a difference, giving the streaked horned larks a shot at the title, at a rebound. Always like to mention Brian. He is kind of the big hero of the show there. You notice his fancy bracelets. But Brian was one of the first eggs that was translocated from Corvallis to Joint Base Lewis McChord. He hatched, he fledged, he returned at least 2 or 3 seasons, he bred, and so his genes have now gotten into the Joint Base Lewis McChord population, and so here's your genetic diversity increasing, and again, the bird's chances of rebounding that much better. Kind of a neat story. A couple of other things they're doing at JBLM with these birds. They got people on the ground now surveying in the spring, looking for nest sites. And when they find them, they tell the airfield managers, they tell the people that coordinate the training exercises, and those people avoid those areas. So giving the birds a chance to grow, to fledge, and to migrate out of there. They're not residents there year round, so to head south. And that has really enabled the birds to increase up to 50 pairs at McChord Field in the last 9 years, and from 12 to 40 pairs on the native prairie in the last 10 years. So a lot of good news there. So these are 2 stories, that Taylor's checker spot and horned lark aimed at specific species. Now here's our last story at JBLM, aimed at an entire system. You're probably familiar with Scott's broom. This is a photo at JBLM, what I would think of as kind of like an old growth forest of Scott's broom. This stuff is nasty, invasive, pernicious. You just fill in the blank. persistent as well. It was brought into this country by a Scotsman back in the 1800s. They were homesick, and they make good brooms. And so the problem is one shrub, one bush has thousands and thousands of seeds, and these things are almost impossible to eradicate, either by pesticides, by burning, by mowing. What they've done for years at JBLM was mow and mow and mow and mow. And then what they started doing in the last decade or so was introducing fire, prescribed burns. And again, playing off the note that native prairie plants respond well to low intensity fires. Scots broom is not a native plant. It doesn't do so good with fires. And so crews have been burning the prairies, averaging about 1,800 acres a year for the last 10 years at JBLM and some other prairie lands in the area. You'll see some trees on fire here. Although Doug fir is native to the region, it's not a native plant of the prairie community. So if you allow Doug fir to come in, it will just turn it into a Doug fir forest. So they're interested in keeping out the Doug fir as well as keeping out Scots broom and other plants that are either non-native or non-prairie plants. Okay, here's some Scots broom taking it, and also some Doug fir in the background. And I think the Gary oak that's here on the left, that looks to me like a Gary oak. That is a prairie plant, and those I believe are also pretty responsive to low intensity fires. So I don't think much damage there. Yeah. So when you pair prescribed burns with a nursery program, you're really onto something. And again, this is with the Sustainability in Prisons project. These incarcerated folks have helped grow a couple million plants. In fact, they kind of wrote the book on 80 different species of native plants that people didn't know how to cultivate in captivity, if you will, indoors in nurseries. Figured out how to cultivate over 80 species of native plants. And so after you have these prescribed burns, then imagine getting these native plants out into the ground. Boom, you've got a chance to counteract the big invasion of the Scots broom and other non-natives. These guys are working with some paintbrush. Here in the foreground is a golden paintbrush, which they've raised thousands of. And this is also a plant that's protected under the Endangered Species Act, and is one of, if you're familiar with the other paintbrushes that you see up in the mountain, this is in the same genus, but this is the prairie paintbrush called golden paintbrush. Yeah. So I think get back on the bus. Yeah, and we've been down here. Let's go make our last stop, okay? This is a short hop from Joint Base Lewis McChord. We're going to go on down and check out the refuge, and I sure hope that as members of Kitsap Audubon, you've been to the refuge a ton of times. And if you haven't, put that on your list of things to do real soon. We're heading down on Monday. We're going to meet our sundown, and we love to walk the refuge and do some birding. And so here's kind of an aerial shot. We're looking north into the estuary at the Nisqually River. So of course, in the foreground, you've got I-5 heading to your left or south would be Olympia, point south, and heading up to the right, up north would be, well, you know, Tacoma, Seattle, and the whole disaster, you know what I mean, up that way. So anyway, we're looking into the estuary here, the delta, where the Nisqually River, predominantly fresh water, comes down and mixes with the salt water of the Puget Sound, making, as you know, one of the most productive, nutrient-rich habitats in the world. Estuaries are just so powerful in all of the life there. Just in one square yard of mud and muck, we could find thousands and thousands of organisms, worms and freshwater shrimp and clams and all sorts of crazy things, just in a square yard of mud and muck. And that's the stuff that drives this whole ecosystem in terms of its productivity. So let's dig in a little bit. Let's get a little closer and see what's going on here. And if we look at the delta, it's gone through a lot of changes over the ages. And if we try to imagine, its natural condition before people, thousands of years ago, okay? And then a couple thousand years ago, native people, the Nisqually people, villages, people of the saltwater living, right there at the mouth of the river. And then European American settlers coming in the 1800s, the McAllister and other families that came into that area, Medicine Creek, now called McAllister Creek. And then on a dismal day in December in 1854, representatives of Nisqually and other native groups affixed their marks to the Treaty of Medicine Creek. And they ceded many, many square miles to the federal government in exchange for to reserve the right to hunt and fish and gather in their usual and accustomed locations. And after that, for the next 50 or 60 years, there probably wasn't a lot of change, a human-induced change in the Nisqually Delta area until Brown's Farm came into being. And you might know the story of Alson Brown. He was a Seattle lawyer who had a vision of creating an industrial scale farm down on the Delta. And one of the first things he did was hire a crew and a team of horses, and they moved a lot of dirt and they built a dike. And the idea was keep the water out. On the inside was where the farm was going to dry out and be built. And it was a big operation. It was doomed. I don't know if it was doomed from the start, but it did not last for very long. However, the effects of the dike and the impacts lasted for over 100 years. Over 100 years. Well, the Delta got a huge break when a group of activists were able to convince the federal government to proclaim the area a national wildlife refuge in, I believe, 1974. And so becoming part of the National Wildlife Refuge system in many ways was going to protect the land from development, yet still the Fish and Wildlife Service manages that land as they see fit. These are the barns, which are still remnants. If you've been to the refuge, you know where these are. I believe there is the bald eagles. Last I heard, were using that nest near the barn. So next time you go, check and see if there are some eagles nesting right near the barns. These are kind of a landmark, and I'm going to use these as a landmark in a couple of other photos I'm going to share with you in a minute. But this was a big deal to get this land protected as a wildlife refuge. And then an even bigger deal came up about 35 years later when the tribe and the Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Geological Survey, a bunch of groups, Ducks Unlimited was a big player, got together all the money and all the permits to remove the 5 miles of dike that Brown and his crew had built in the early 20th century. And what that was going to serve to do was reconnect the Nisqually River to Puget Sound. In building the dike, that's effectively what Brown had done, was cut the river off from the sound. And so in 2009, this is an excavator on the dike, basically removing it. And I can't remember how much, 5 miles of dike is a lot of dirt. And I'm not even sure where all that dirt went. But what they did was they restored hundreds of acres. They also installed a new kind of an inland freshwater dike that made a great pond for waterfowl. And at the end of the day, what they did was, removing the old dike, reconnect the river with Puget Sound. So here are the barns that we just saw a photo of. I've got them circled kind of as a point of reference. And this is the before picture. This is the dike. And you can see, right, you see cut off river. Look at this cutoff right here. Amazing, right? That's what the dike did. So I want you to look in this area. I'm going to show you an after picture. So here's the before. After the dike was removed, same area right here, look at all the flow through now, where the river to the right is getting reconnected with Puget Sound to the left. And I'm told that after this photo was taken, much more of this sediment moved out into the sound and much more. In fact, there are maps that show that this new quotation marks river, all of the connections look very much like the river was connected before the dike was put in. So it's really kind of reclaimed its historic lineage, if you will. Pretty interesting idea. So I think, you know, we think of that, we think of this, the Delta through the ages, and now, you know, it's maybe moving a little back toward a natural condition. Certainly people are still part of the equation. And as long as we are, there's going to be human impacts, just as we saw up at Paradise. So from one end of the watershed to the other, we're going to see anthropogenic effects, human effects, and yet so many good projects, so much good effort going on in the watershed here. And so as we start to wrap up this talk, and so here we are in the parking lot at the Refuge, and we're standing outside the bus, and you know, I'm moving some hot air one more time, you know, just kind of wrapping things up with you and maybe stealing some of your snacks from you. You know, I often think about, and when we go to Nisqually, we'll talk about this next week, I always think about the people that have poured their lifeblood and their energy into this watershed, you know, their love of it, working for its good, for the rehabilitation of it, restoring so much of the habitats and various little ecosystems. And I think of one person like who is really representative of the grit, you know, the hard work, the determination, the lifetime commitment. And, you know, the person I usually end up thinking about the most is Billy Frank Jr., who was, of course, a Nisqually tribal leader. He was an activist at the tribal, local, state, regional, federal levels to such an extent that President Obama gave him the presidential awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Just last year, Washington State Legislature decided that it's going to be his statue in the Statuary Hall in the U.S. Capitol soon. So I think it was only right and righteous and honorable that after Billy passed in 2016, the refuge was named in his honor. It's called the Billy Frank Jr. Nisqually National Wildlife Refuge. And I just like to finish with one of my favorite Billy Frank quotes. And what Billy said was, "I don't believe in magic. I believe in the sun and the stars, the water, the tides, the floods, the owls, the hawks flying, the river running, the wind talking. They're measurements. They tell us how healthy things are, how healthy we are, because we and they are the same." That's what I believe in. Those who listen to the world that sustains them can hear the message brought forth by the salmon. And as we start to scoot into the question and answer period, if you'd like a copy of the book, that would be great. You can get it from me at my website. My shipping manager, AKA my wife, Valerie, is in the next room over here, and she'd be happy to send you a copy. It's justmyname.com, or support your local booksellers. If you like, that would be great too. Okay, so I'm going to stop my share and come back to you. And if you would like to go live now so we could see each other, that's fine. Or if you just want to stay as a member of the Witness Protection Program, I'm good with that too. But Michael, we'll get to the questions, and we'll see what folks have come up with.
Sure, great presentation as always, Jeff. There's a lot to learn. I appreciated the bus ride. A little bumpy in a couple spots, but overall, I think you got us from point A to point B, and definitely a way to end it with that quote by Billy Frank Jr. So appreciate that.
Yeah.
So once again, if you want to have a question, you could go ahead and raise your hand. I see Vic has a question, or you can put it in the chat. So Vic, why don't you go first?
Sure. Jeff, wonderful talk as always, and really appreciate you being with us here this evening. In my study of big trees in Washington State, I had come across that the largest known Douglas fir was found in or near the area of Mineral, which is just south of Ashford, I believe. And I think it was actually discovered or noted after it fell down in a storm. And this is like back in the early 1900s. and I had heard that there is a cross section cut of that tree that is at the Carson Station for the United States Forest Service down on
Really?
the north side of the Columbia River. And I was just wondering if you were aware of that, or if you had seen or heard that story, because I've seen a picture of it, and it's just unbelievable. I mean, there's people standing next to it, and it's laying down. It's much taller than they are.
Yeah. And I wonder how it got down to, it's down at the Carson Hatchery?
Well, is it the Forest Service office at in Carson? I guess I haven't been there. I haven't done the
Okay.
research, you know.
Well, we should take a field trip and
I think that's a good idea. I'm with you on that.
and check that out. You saw the photo just a few photos ago of Billy Frank Jr. with a tree that was, and I didn't mention this, but that was known as the treaty tree, and it was a Doug fir that was actually the last standing remaining tree that had been standing at the time of the Medicine Creek Treaty in the 1850s, but it was probably nowhere near the giant that you're talking about.
Yeah, well, reportedly the largest Douglas fir tree ever found or recorded.
Yeah.
So anyway, something to think about if you do hear of anything more about that. I need to look back into it just from my research.
You do that.
So a lot of good accolades in the chat. And once again, if you want to ask a question, you could do it through the chat, or turn your camera on and raise your hand, and we can have you go next. But in the meantime, I'll ask a quick question, Jeff. So that prison program, it sounds like it's really successful in, growing those plants, native plants. Do any of the prisoners have the opportunity to actually plant them and/or see them growing in the wild? Is there a program that allows them to kind of see it full circle, so they, I guess, feel like what they've accomplished is actually working?
Yeah. Good question, Michael, and thank you. So I have seen some footage. I haven't been in the field with them, but I have seen some footage of incarcerated people being there for a butterfly release. And talk about an emotional experience. These people that have spent months hand feeding, if you can imagine hand feeding a butterfly with the end of a toothpick, is what these folks do. And then getting an opportunity to go out and see these butterflies be released. It was a pretty powerful clip. I don't know if there's anything on YouTube, but I wouldn't be surprised if you couldn't find it. What isn't on YouTube, right? And I should also mention Sustainability in Prisons Project has something going on in each of the 12 state correctional facilities. So we have 12 facilities in Washington. They have a Sustainability in Prisons project going on in every one of those facilities, doing different things. Some of the facilities are going as green as they can, and they're raising a lot of their own food. Others are making sure that they have great recycling programs. Some have raised frogs. There's just been a whole amazing amount of different projects that incarcerated people have really, so they develop a relationship with nature and can do some good work for the environment. And as you said, occasionally they can get out and really see what their work looks like. Oh, the other thing I should mention, Michael, is that there was some work release crews from one of the Western Washington men's facilities that has gone out and collected seed for the plant program. So if you can imagine collecting seed by hand, that's not like anything but tedious and hard work. But people go out and do that. And so they have also been out in the field to, kind of do some of that sort of work.
Well, excellent. And once again, more accolades in the chat. Thank you for your teaching, your dedication, learning experience, fabulous program. So
thanks.
Kudos again for that.
It's a pleasure. I'm just about out of gas, Vic. I don't know what you're going to have me come back and do. I've only got like one or two or three talks left. So I don't know, maybe we can get a new crew of people and I can do the same talk in a couple of years or something. But
Well,
you've done this for 15 years, Vic.
holy cow. Wow.
That's what Gene said.
Yeah. Well, and maybe when we go on that field trip together, we can talk more about alternative program ideas.
Yeah. 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 And, and Vic, if you want to, talk to the people at Kitsap Audubon that organize your trips, if you guys would like to take a trip, either up to the mountain or to Nisqually, I'd be happy, to join you at either place. I'm sure there are birders in Kitsap Audubon that are as good a birders or better than me, but just the same, it would be fun if the group would enjoy, if and when we get on the other side of the next variant, if the group would enjoy a field trip. I always enjoy spending time in the field with groups.
Well, lots of people saying thanks again, and I can see folks on the screen clapping. So
Thank you.
yeah,
Thanks, everybody.
well,
Really
really
great to be
appreciate
with
it,
you.
Jeff. Great job as always.
Thank you. All right. Well, I'm going to go up to the mountain tomorrow and see if there's any snow up there. I think there will be. But a buddy and I are going to try a little bit of snowshoeing. We have both been triple vaccinated and really careful. So we're hoping we can have a good, safe day. And gosh, I hope we have a chance to meet again, folks. I really appreciate the opportunity to do this. And again, thank you to Vic for getting your claws in me and not letting go. And thanks for everybody for showing up. It's really a pleasure to be with you. So thanks again. And if there's no other questions, I think I'll say good night. All right, everybody.
All right.
Thanks again. So long.
Good night, Jeff.
Bye-bye.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone. This concludes the program for tonight. Enjoy the rest of your night and the holiday weekend, and hope you have good birding and enjoy the outdoors.
Thanks, Michael. Good night.
Yep. Good night.